Would it please the débat, the honourable member for St. John's South, Mount Earl.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To start, I'll be splitting my time with the member for the great riding of Sherbrooke. Not as great as the great riding of St. John's South, Mount Pearl, but a close second, Mr. Speaker. I stand in support of Bill C-12, an act to amend the Corrections and Conditional Release Act, also known as the Drug-Free Prison Act. But then that name is misleading. The title is misleading, Mr. Speaker, incredibly misleading. This bill will not lead to drug-free federal prisons. I'm sorry to say, Mr. Speaker. There's not a chance of drug-free prisons without two things, Mr. Speaker, resources and rehabilitation. And that word, rehabilitation, is not in the Conservative dictionary. It's not in the Conservative budget. It's not in the Conservative mindset, Mr. Speaker. Good luck to the interpreters in trying to explain the concept of rehabilitation through the Conservative earpieces, Mr. Speaker. The interpreters will earn their money this evening, Mr. Speaker. This bill will do nothing, if anything, to achieve drug-free prison status. What Bill C-12 will do is add a provision to the Corrections and Conditional Release Act whereby the parole board may use a positive urine test for drugs or refusal to take a urine test in making its decisions on parole eligibility. In other words, Mr. Speaker, if you're a prison inmate and you test positive to a urine test for drugs or refuse to take that urine test, you may not get out on parole. Now, the rub with this bill, Mr. Speaker, is that the Parole Board of Canada already considers prison drug tests when making its decisions on the eligibility of offenders for parole. So there's nothing new in this bill, Mr. Speaker. It just gives clear legal authority to an existing practice that my party, that the New Democratic Party of Canada supports. So the title, Drug-Free Prisons Act, is misleading, as I said earlier. There's nothing new here. Now, oddly enough, Mr. Speaker, when I was preparing for this speech and reading up on the Drug-Free Prisons Act, my thoughts kept turning to seals. Harp seals in the North Atlantic, for example, Mr. Speaker. Now, I can see from your face, Mr. Speaker, that you look puzzled. Now, how can I make the leap? How can I make the leap from Drug-Free Prisons Act to seals? Well, Mr. Speaker, I'll explain it to you. Back in early March, I gave a speech right here in this very spot in support of Bill C-555, an act respecting the marine mammal regulations. That bill would increase the distance that an unofficial observer, a seal hunt protester, for example, must keep from sealers going about their business of killing seals. Now, right now, it's against the law for an unofficial observer to come within a half nautical mile of the hunt. Bill C-555 would increase that buffer zone from a half mile to a full mile. So only the half mile, here's the thing, Mr. Speaker, only the half mile that's there now is not enforced. It's not enforced. So increasing the distance to a full nautical mile is lip service. It means absolutely nothing. So what I said in my speech is that Bill C-555 is a sham. It's a charade. It's an illusion. It's a nuisance bill, Mr. Speaker, to make it appear that the Conservative government is defending the seal hunt, to make it appear that the government is the champion of the seal hunt, when it is so clearly not. Under this Conservative government, Mr. Speaker, we've seen the biggest collapse of seal markets in history. Now, back to the Drug-Free Prisons Act, Mr. Speaker. What's the correlation? What's the connection? It's that the Drug-Free Prisons Act is also a charade, Mr. Speaker. Deja vu all over again. This bill will have minimal impact on drugs in prison. The title is absolutely misleading. What this Conservative government is doing is using legislation to create an opportunity to pander to its base without presenting a real solution to the issue of drugs and gangs in our prisons. The Conservatives will tell their base that they passed the Drug-Free Prisons Act. Great. Conservative job done. Only, Mr. Speaker, the job is not done. It's more conservative sham, conservative charade, conservative illusion, sleight of hand, just like the seal bill, Mr. Speaker. In fact, Mr. Speaker, this government is making prisons less safe by cutting funding to prison programs such as substance abuse. This government is making prisons less safe by increasing the use of double bunking that leads to overcrowding, that leads, Mr. Speaker, to more violence. Now, it's well known, Mr. Speaker, that a high percentage of inmates at our prisons who abuse drugs also suffer from mental illness. At the same time, the budget of the Correctional Service of Canada for core funding such as substance abuse has been cut. Makes sense out of that, Mr. Speaker. And this Conservative government has closed treatment centres for inmates dealing with serious mental illness. But, Mr. Speaker, we have a Drug-Free Prisons Act. So problem solved is all good, Mr. Speaker. It's a charade. A flashy title does not solve the problem. Prisons, Mr. Speaker, should be renamed. They should be renamed crime schools. Crime schools that are endorsed by a Conservative government that fails to address double bunking, that fails to address gangs, a Conservative government that fails to support rehabilitation and drug abuse or mental illness. The Conservative crime school in my riding, Mr. Speaker, is known as Her Majesty's Penitentiary on the shores of Kitty Lake in East End, St. John's. Now, Newfoundland and Labrador, Mr. Speaker, is the only province in Canada without a federal prison. Her Majesty's Penitentiary is a provincial institution that takes in federal inmates. Now, the federal government, the Conservatives, have long promised to help build a new penitentiary, Mr. Speaker, but we're not holding our breath, Mr. Speaker, because if we did, we'd be long dead. Her Majesty's Penitentiary boasts a block that was built in 1849, 100 years before Confederation, before Canada joined Newfoundland and Labrador. A prison that is 165 years of age. Imprisoning inmates there has been compared to taking people from the 21st century and putting them back into the 19th century. Now, the latest story on Her Majesty's Penitentiary is from today, Mr. Speaker. Earlier today, just today, according to a CBC story, 3 inmates of Her Majesty's Penitentiary were charged after assaulting another inmate over the weekend with a broom handle. Now, the victim was treated in hospital and released, thankfully. Now, the story quotes the head of the union representing correctional officers as saying that the weekend assault was the fifth, Mr. Speaker, violent incident at that facility since last summer. And some of these incidents have included riots and hostage-taking. Now, the union leader, the leader representing correctional officers at Her Majesty's Penitentiary, she says that it's become a more violent place with prisoners involved in drug and gang activity inside prison walls. Drug and gang activity inside prison walls. Will the Drug-Free Prisons Act, Mr. Speaker, will the Drug-Free Prisons Act change that? Not a chance. Not at Her Majesty's Penitentiary, Mr. Speaker, and not at federal prisons around this country. Conservatives are not addressing drug addictions at our prisons, or mental illness, or gangs, or overcrowding, or double bunking, or self-harm, suicides, in other words, Mr. Speaker. Conservative legislation such as mandatory minimums is leading to an increase in prison populations at the same time that prisons are closing, or prisons that should be replaced aren't being replaced, Mr. Speaker. Now, I like the advice of the federal correctional investigator. The advice is this: prisoners should be assessed at intake into a prison so that addiction problems are identified and there can be better access to rehabilitation programs. What a novel concept, Mr. Speaker. Treating problems as they're assessed. According to the 2011-2012 report of the Office of the Correctional Investigator, almost 2/3 of offenders were under the influence of a drug when they committed the offense that led to their imprisonment. 4 out of 5 offenders arrive at a federal institution with a past history of substance abuse. Meantime, the Correctional Service of Canada devotes between 2% and 2.7% of its total operating budget on core correctional programs like substance abuse. Is that enough, Mr. Speaker? No, sir. Not nearly enough. And the Drug-Free Prisons Act why we support it. Is that enough? No, sir, Mr. Speaker, it's not enough. If the Conservatives tell you different, and they will, well, sir, Mr. Speaker, it's just another charade, a sham, an illusion. It is the Conservative way. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? Question come on tide. The honourable member for Kingston and the Islands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, many people in my riding of Kingston and the Islands would like to see drug-free prisons, or at least prisons with less use of drugs, because they work in the prisons. The Prime Minister has said, what you don't measure, you can't manage. My question to my honourable colleague is, in this bill, is there any provision for providing funds to actually measure the effect of this bill, to measure what change, first of all, a baseline for drug use and what change there is in drug use in prisons? Is there any provision in this bill to actually measure the effect of this bill?
The honourable member for St. John's South, Mount Pearl.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for the question. There is no money in this bill, Mr. Speaker, to measure the extent of the problem, to assess the extent of the problem, or, Mr. Speaker, there's also no money in this bill to treat the problem. Thank you.
Questions and comments? Question come on tide. The honourable member for Kildonan, St. Paul.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Perhaps it's late in the hour, but I thought I heard the member opposite say that he supported the bill, and I don't know if that is correct or not. I would like the member to clarify that. And secondly, I heard a lot of criticism about the drug-free prisons bill, but the second question is, does the member not agree that for the first time this issue is being talked about and attacked and tried to do something about the problem where drugs flow freely in many prisons across this country? Can the member please answer those two questions?
The honourable member for St. John's South, Mount Pearl.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for the question. It's a good question. I've struggled with this a bit because I find myself, there's been certain bills that have come before this House that I've agreed with, like the SEAL bill that I mentioned in my speech, like the offshore liability bill that was brought forward to this House a few months ago, like this bill, like this drug-free prisons bill. I do agree with them, but they don't go far enough, not nearly enough. This particular bill won't do anything to address the problem with drugs in our prisons. It certainly won't make them drug-free, like the misleading title of this bill indicates. The bills don't go nearly far enough. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Question come on tide. Questions and comments. L'honorable député.
The Honourable Member for Alfred Pellan. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I'd like to thank my colleague from St. John's for his speech today. I think he has really summed up the position of people in this party on Bill C-12. Earlier in his remarks, he said that the Drug-Free Prisons Act is a rather misleading title because that's not what this will lead to. Correctional services already have discretional power to undertake this sampling, so it doesn't really change anything. I have 3 federal penitentiaries in my riding, and since the Conservatives came to power, correctional officers have been very concerned because there's more and more double bunking in our prisons, and this is becoming a security issue for those who work in prisons. In fact, these are becoming crime schools, plainly and simply. So I'd like to know what my colleague thinks about the Conservative attitude, which is to pretend that it is tackling a problem rather than actually tackling it, and rather than turning to rehabilitation and the kinds of programs that are really needed in our correctional services.
For St. John's South, Mount Pearl.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for the question. As I said in my speech, what this bill amounts to is the Conservative government pandering to its base. If we already have drug tests that are being used in determining eligibility for parole. If that's already happening now, this makes it official. It's really absolutely nothing new. The member makes a great point. The real problems, and the real problems that I pointed out in my speech, like addictions, like mental illness, are not being addressed. Program funding is actually being cut. And until we see inmates, we see prisoners being rehabilitated, you're going to see inmates, you're going to see a revolving door into penitentiaries right across this country. The problems have to be addressed. This bill does not address those problems.
Reprise de débat.
Resuming debate.